Well, welcome to the workshop. I'm John Olson, the Secretary-Treasurer for CABW. So CABW organizes these workshops, and we basically lean on people to come out and basically pitch these things for free. The idea being you guys would pay some money that we can use to support students. So we use it to support student travel. And especially with the Australia coming up as the next conference, we'd like to actually send 3 students to Australia in this next year. So if you haven't already donated, I would ask you again one last time to donate $20. I have a student out front, and we'll take your check or let you do Venmo or PayPal. And if you can spend the $20 to help get a student to Australia, and and basically thank Chris and all our people for having come out and given this. But thank you for your time, Chris. It's all yours.
Thanks, John. Let me get the clicker. Hi, everyone. I'm Chris Taniguchi-Kwan. I'm a senior scientist at SQURP. Really happy for you all to join us today on a workshop on the California Environmental Flows Framework. Today, we're going to be giving you an overview of the framework, go over some of the ways that the framework has been used on the ground, and then also give you a taste of some of the tools that have been developed through this effort. And I do want to acknowledge all of my colleagues and co-organizers of this workshop: Ted Grantham, Sarah Yarnell, Julie Zimmerman, Alyssa Obester, Alex Millward, and Eric Stein. And so before we start with the workshop, I wanted to kind of go over some of the key goals that we're hoping everyone will get out of this workshop today. We want to provide an overview of CEFF, including the science that's underpinning the environmental flows framework. We also want to highlight case study applications and introduce available tools and data that we've produced through this effort. And then, of course, lastly, we want to be able to spur discussion and opportunities for collaboration with you all. So we're really interested to know how you plan on using the tools in your study areas and in regions of interest. And so we have a pretty packed agenda, and so here you can see everything that we're going to be presenting on. The way that this workshop is structured, we have 15 to 20-minute presentations that are all going to be given by people on the technical team that actually developed CEFF. And then at the end, we have a hands-on tool demonstration in R, which includes the functional flows calculator demonstration. And so with that, first off, Sarah Yarnell is going to give an overview of the framework and the science of functional flows. Ted Grantham is going to go over some of the functional flow modeling that's been done across the state of California. We're going to pause for a 10-minute Q&A. For those 2 presentations, and then we have some time in there for a break if people need to stand or get some air. And then we're going to jump back at 2:45 and talk about CEFF applications. So we have Alyssa Obester and Alex Millward here from California Department of Fish and Wildlife. They're going to go over how they've been using CEFF for the in-stream flows program. And then I'm going to be giving an overview of one of the case studies that was implemented in South Orange County. And then we'll have another Q&A session. We want to see if you have any questions or discussion from these applications. And then lastly, we're going to finish off by talking about the tools that have been developed, including the Natural Flows database. It's an online interactive web tool. And then I'll end with kind of giving a glimpse into where we see we're headed in the future with CEFF. And then we'll have the tool demonstration at 4. Depending on how many people are going to stay for the tool demonstration, we may just stay in this room and kind of transition over to these tables here. But if there's more people, we can move over to the coastal room that's next door. I do want to note that we put out a special issue in the journal Frontiers of Environmental Science, Freshwater Science. This special issue is called Environmental Flows in an Uncertain Future. And so this was one of the ways that we wanted to provide external peer review of the CEFF products that we've developed through this effort. There's 20 or 21 total articles in the special issue, and 6 of them are related to CEFF. And everything's open access, so you can visit the link here. I'll also share all of our PowerPoints and the links that we're presenting here today too, so you can check that out. And this also gives us an opportunity to highlight CEFF in the context of international efforts. So there's a suite of other papers that were published all about environmental flow implementation across the globe. And this is just a snapshot of the the 6 studies that are related to CEFF. Sorry, it's really hard to read the screen here. Today Ted is gonna be going over one of them, modeling of functional flows, and then I'm also gonna be presenting on the South Orange County case study. But I encourage everyone to check out all of the other papers that we published in the special issue. So with that, I'm gonna hand over the mic to Sarah Yarnell.
Okay. Hi, everyone. Thanks for joining and hanging in there with us this afternoon. So you'll hear, I'm going to give a presentation that goes over the overview of the California Environmental Flows Framework. I'm going to talk pretty fast, and some of the slides that I'm going to show are just an introduction to some of the more detailed talks that you'll hear this afternoon. All right, so the California Environmental Flows Framework, it's a big collaborative effort. It started back almost a little over 5 years ago now. And it's an effort that has been among universities, NGOs, several of the different agencies, and it's we're at the point now where I think we've really been able to put forward a bunch of pieces, and we're excited to share with everybody about it. There was a technical team that was a lot of the core of the group that put together the framework. A lot of the folks are here this afternoon that you'll hear from. Others are up there as well. There is a technical report that summarizes the framework that is available on one of the websites that you'll see. And I'm just going to go through and give an overview of the background of it, and then you'll hear more details from everybody this afternoon. So CEFF, the California Environmental Flows Framework, it is essentially, it's a technical guidance document that goes through providing a framework and guidance for how to implement a functional flows approach throughout all streams in California. It's a multi-step process that we'll go through here. I'll show the steps of explaining about it. And a couple key definitions that are important to, we start right off with explaining some of these terms. Environmental flows gets used in a lot of different ways, in a lot of different contexts, and it's important to understand how we use these terms within CEFF for clarity purposes. And you'll hear these terms used throughout the rest of the presentation, so we want to start right off with explaining them. So we establish a distinction between ecological flow criteria and environmental flow recommendations as 2 separate things. Ecological flow criteria are those metrics that describe the types of flows or the range of flows within rivers that support the natural functions of ecosystems. This would be, what are those types of flows that are really supportive of the ecology only, not taking human use into account? We distinguish those from environmental flows, which are then more of that consider human uses are a balanced approach. So when the agencies are putting out environmental flow recommendations, these are often the types of flows that are taking ecology into account and taking human uses into account. These are the ultimate flows that eventually get into the in-stream, under the in-stream flow programs or things that the board will do. And so as we move forward, it's important that when you hear us talk about ecological flow criteria, we're talking about those flows specifically for the ecosystem, whereas environmental flows are those that take human uses and are balanced. So it's important. I start right off with that because these terms get tossed around. People often use them interchangeably, and we very specifically do not use them interchangeably in the framework. Okay, all of the information that you're going to be hearing about this afternoon is available at ceff.ucdavis.edu. This website sort of serves as the portal that will take you into where you can find all of this information. And there are links to other places with other information that you'll hear about today. So if you're going to remember one website, the easiest one to remember is ceff.ucdavis.edu. Links to the published papers that Chris just talked about is there. Links to the Natural Flows database that you'll hear about this afternoon. You can enter into all of those places from this one website. Okay, so let's get into a little bit about the overview. So environmental flows, basically, again, those balanced flows that we want to keep in the river to support ecological purposes while taking human uses into account are difficult to determine. For the past several decades, right, there have been hundreds of methods to try to determine what the ecology needs, and they've been talked about. They tend to come into 4 broad categories. Those that are hydrologic, where you're just looking at the flow regime and maybe considering something like a percent of flow approach. Those that take the flow and the velocity requirements or stage requirements, depth requirements for species into account. Those that take the physical condition into account, or more of the holistic ecosystem. There are a ton of environmental flow methodologies out there, and we are going to be introducing and talking about functional flows, which is a type of holistic environmental flow method. The nice thing about the way that the framework is set up is that a lot of these different types of data and information that might be out there are useful within the framework. And we'll hopefully have, by the time you see through the steps of the framework, you can kind of get a sense of how these pieces can fit together. Okay, so there are a lot of methods out there. People are all across the state here in California are working, lots of different agencies are working together to try to put better environmental flows down in our rivers to support our ecosystems. And so you might ask, well, what's the problem? There's all these methods out there. Part of the issues is that a lot of those methods, specifically the ones that just focus on flow or just focus on habitat only, tend to be described for a limited set of flow metrics. So you can see a classic weighted usable area curve. Okay, up in the upper right corner, those might be described for a particular species, for a particular life stage of a species, right? These are species-specific types of metrics, and they might describe what that particular species need, but they don't tell you anything else about the other species in the system, right? A lot of times these metrics are averaged over the flow record. They could be static. You're not taking into account different seasons. You're not taking into account different years. And then they're often not process-based. And what we mean by that is that maybe you're not thinking about how the habitat is formed that fish might need or that species might need. So a lot of these types of flow methodologies are really good at looking at a piece of the big stream ecology picture, but it's very difficult to combine all these together to look at the whole ecosystem or the whole picture together. And so this still ends up then being a challenge for how do we go about putting the right types of flows down in the river. And another key point is that a lot of times when we get into our regulatory environments or our policy decisions, people want to know how much water. Well, how much water does the environment need? What's that volume? And so that's sometimes not the most helpful way to look at it, because volume alone isn't necessarily going to describe what your ecosystem might need. So for example, if you look at the 2 hydrographs that are up there at the top, the area under the curve of both those shaded hydrographs, that's the same volume over the course of a year. But you can see that the patterns are very, very different, and they're providing quite a different type of environment down in the stream system, right? The natural flow pattern over there on the left has a natural flood that can get out onto the floodplain, right? There's high flows that are spreading out. It has natural low flows. There's these pulses in between, and there's a distinct seasonality. You can see a wet season where there's more water in the river and a dry season where there's not. Conversely, the graph over on the right, in the upper right there, it has the same flow volume, it has the same amount of water, but you can see that the pattern and the timing of when that water is going down is fundamentally different. Those are going to be providing very different things for the species in the stream, and one is maybe not going to be as helpful for the species that are in that system. So when we think about environmental flows, we don't want to be asking the question, how much water? We want to be asking the question of how much water, when, and where. Right? We want to look at that pattern, and we want to make sure that we're providing flows in our ecological and environmental flows that are really providing what those species are adapted to and what they need over the course of a year and, of course, over the course of multiple years. So one approach that is a more holistic view, so this idea of holistic environmental flows is like we want to look at the ecosystem as a whole, we want to look at the patterns, we want to look at the habitat, we want to look at more than just one species. There are several approaches that are out there. One such approach is the functional flows approach. And the idea behind functional flows is that you want to focus on those pieces of the hydrograph, of the annual hydrograph, that do the most process-based work in the system, right? So we want to support natural disturbances. You want to keep a flood in the system because the flood does so much work. It floods out onto the floodplain, it scours sediment, it recreates habitat. We know that a peak flow is very, very important, and we want to keep that in the system because it does a lot of work for us. We want to promote these physical dynamics. We don't want to think about just at a moment in time, what does one species need on this day, but how do we help create and maintain that habitat over time, right, by using the flow and the habitat together. So we're looking for these pieces of the system of the hydrograph that really drive ecosystem functions and create all of those habitats and all of that biodiversity in the system that we need, right? And this requires thinking not just about the flow, but about the channel setting or the habitat that the flow is working through. The graphs over here on the right sort of provide a different way to think about that. We know that in the upper graph on the right, higher magnitude flows or larger flows are going to be doing more scour. They're going to spread out more. You're going to get connection to your floodplain. And so different magnitudes are going to be doing different things physically within the system. But also the timing of when those flows go down, which is that lower graph, is going to be different for different species cues. So those bars up there, hopefully you can see, like for example, the very top one says cottonwood. That's the time seeding window when cottonwood release their leaves, right, or release their seeds. And so they are going to be cued into, no matter what's happening in the river, that's typically when their seeds hatch. And for them, their life cycle is based on the fact that if those seeds can land in the river, float downstream, settle out on a wet gravel bar, and then those flows gradually, slowly recede from the spring into the summer. Those seeds germinate, their roots grow, and they follow that receding water line down, right? That's their natural timing of how they've evolved. So if the flows are there to provide that at the time when the cottonwood is seeding, then the cottonwood can regenerate. If those flows are not provided when the cottonwood are seeding, the cotton don't regenerate and they don't survive, right? So timing of flows is super important based on all of the life history strategies, and the magnitude of flow can do different things within the system in terms of creating habitat or scouring or maintaining habitat over time. So the idea behind functional flows, like I said, is to focus on pieces of the hydrograph that we know are really important for functioning, right? So again, it's the definition being a component that provides a distinct geomorphic, ecologic, or biogeochemical function. So 4 potential functions for, this is a hydrograph representative in California. This would be like a mixed rain-snow hydrograph we might get, like, for example, out of the Sierra Nevada. The wet season or the dry season runs through the summer from August to October. And that first wet season initiation flow or a fall pulse flow, the rains come in October and November. They start to run off the landscape, and you'll typically start to see the flows increase in the stream. Those are really important for providing migration cues for fish, for flushing the nutrients, cleaning out the river. And so we might want to choose to keep that particular pulse flow in the river and not capture it behind a dam or not divert it away, right? Similarly, peak flows we know are very important. The big flows are what do all the work in our system in terms of changing habitat. That flow gets out onto the floodplain, it scours habitat, it creates new habitat. And so rather than saying, hey, let's have 5 small peaks, let's have one really big peak that can do a lot of work, and maybe those other peaks are the ones that can be captured behind the dam. So we focus on having at least one peak flow in the wetter years when that water is available. And then every year, the spring pulse and recession, this is typically tied to snowmelt. This is very important ecologically to cue species. And so like the cottonwood and some of the other species, a lot of our native species are tied into this really predictable timing that happens every year. Every year, some snow will melt, and it will gradually work its way down through the system, going from the wet season down into the dry season. So we want to preserve that timing cue, that availability of water for the species to be there. And then we do have a natural dry season base flow. Flows do go to low flow in California. That's part of our natural hydrology, and our native species are adapted to that. So we want to maintain having a relative difference between the wet season and the dry season. Those lower dry season flows relative to higher wet season flows will often limit non-native species that are not adapted to that, but our native species are adapted to it. So these are the types of components we might want to preserve within an environmental flow regime. I'm going to go through this pretty quickly, but essentially here's some key points about the peak magnitude flow. You know, the spilling out on the floodplain, preventing vegetation encroachment. And really these peak magnitude flows do their functions, they provide their functionality when they're given space. So if I have a channelized system and that high water can't spill out onto the floodplain or is not scouring away a bar, it's not really doing the function that we want it to do. So you don't want to put down a high flow down a canal. We want to put down a high flow down a channel where it can spill out and it can access the floodplain, or it can scour away a bar, or it can cover a bar to create spawning habitat, right? So these peak flows need to be, taken into account and considered with the habitat they're flowing through. The spring recession flow is really great for the timing of a lot of ecological species. Salmon, foothill-legged frogs, cottonwood, a lot of our native species are tied into doing their breeding and outmigration during the spring recession. So we want to leave that flow in there as well and make sure that, and this happens every year. There's always snowmelt every year, so that spring recession happens every year. We want to make sure we're mimicking that aspect and providing those cues for those species. And then lastly, we want to think about the fact that, especially in California, we have wet years, we have dry years, we have some years that are in between, but mostly we get wet years and dry years. But it's different, right, depending on our climate. And so the flows should not look the same every single year. We don't want to just release down the same kind of template hydrograph when we're thinking about environmental flows. We want to have, it's okay to have lower peaks in drier years if we have higher peaks in wetter years, right? This is what nature does. This interannual variability provides the opportunity for lots of different species to be able to have a boom year or a bust year, right? And so we want to cue off of those natural climatic conditions and potentially allow for some interannual variability. But you'll notice that all four of those key components are still there. We still want to have a spring recession every year. We still want to, if it's be able to put down a higher magnitude flow that can connect in the wintertime and the dry year, even if it's a dry year. So we're sort of preserving those components in different years, but maybe they're shaped a little bit differently. Some might be larger. The timing might shift a little bit depending on the climatic conditions. And then lastly, I feel like sometimes we can't say this point enough, that these functional flows need to function. So we focus on flow because it's an environmental flow regime. That's what we can control. We can release that out of the dam. But those flows are running across the landscape, and they are inherently connected. We often get asked, wait, is it the flow or is it the habitat? Maybe I just need to go fix the habitat. It's both. It's both. You can't, I could fix the habitat, but if there's no water to run over the habitat, hasn't helped, right? So it's about flow plus habitat together, and we really have to consider those in conjunction with each other if we're going to think about a holistic ecosystem-based perspective where we're trying to really provide benefits to the ecology and the ecosystem. Okay, so that's the concept or the idea behind a functional flows approach, a more holistic method for environmental flows. You can imagine, though, that how do we think about implementing or putting this into practice throughout California? It's really hard. California is huge. We are a very complex and diverse state. You can imagine we've got redwoods in the north coast. We've got desert in the south. And we have a lot of people everywhere. There's lots of demands on the system. We have agriculture. We have urban areas. We have grazed land. And so it becomes really difficult to try to balance these flow needs when you're thinking about the spatial and complexity that we have in California. And on top of it, just to add to that, we have built this incredible infrastructure throughout California that basically alters our flow regime. So this graph over here on the right is some work that Julie and others did several years ago, looking at what is the nature of the flow alteration throughout the state. And essentially what you're seeing here is that over 95% of gauge locations are altered one way or the other. The red ones show depletion, so they're depleted at some point during the winter, or they're artificially inflated during the summer. So that means the flows are too low in the winter and they're too high in the summer. We've taken that seasonal hydrograph and we've flatlined it, right? So we're storing the water in the winter to release the water in the summer when people need it. And that's super great for people, but now you've taken away all the cues and all the ecological functionality that our species need. So if we're going to try to figure out how to balance these things, we have to consider and take a lot of this into account. So this is not an easy problem to fix, obviously. It's very difficult. And so one of the impetus behind the California Environmental Flows Framework was to try to coordinate these efforts. Every agency in California is working to do some sort of environmental flow, working towards some aspect of improving stream flows and water reliability and sustainability in the state. But they tend to work in different agencies. They have different management needs. They have different management mandates. They're working in different locations. And so all of this was leading to really poor coordination, a lot of great people trying to do great things, but struggling to talk to each other, struggling to share data. So a lot of inefficiencies. So a lot of folks then got together, like I said, to put together this framework, a technical team from across the state, across the agencies, across NGOs, and across academia to try to figure out if there's a way that we can guide folks towards a more effective approach of thinking about environmental flows in the state. So we've come up with, collectively, CEFF, California Environmental Flows Framework. And there are essentially 3 primary sections. There's a lot of text words up there that I'm sorry, I know you can't read. But essentially, we have sections A, B, and C. The first 2 sections are to determine ecological flow criteria. So that first phase, what is it that the river needs from an ecological viewpoint? We have a lot of great science, we have a lot of studies out there, and we have a lot of knowledge. Let's put that to work and first determine what the ecology needs. Section C then goes into, provides guidance on how to then convert and take into account human uses to come up with balanced environmental flow recommendations, right? So the first 2, sections A and B, are really about this science-based assessment. What do the streams need ecologically speaking? Section A, the reason it's broken into 2 sections is section A is we have already done the first step for you, and we've provided natural functional flow metrics for every stream in the state. This is what you're going to hear about from Julie and Kirk, and this is all on the TNC's natural flows database. So the place to start is go there. Go there, look at your natural functional flow metrics, then take into account your channel setting, and that's where section B comes into play. You can take into account, like, is my channel very altered? Maybe I do have a ditch in a canal, and maybe I need to think about whether or not a full natural peak flow is really gonna perform the functions that I need. So that process, there's steps in section A and B to walk through that. And then section C is taking those ecological flow criteria, balancing, analyzing them, doing a trade-off analysis with human uses to come up with environmental flow recommendations. Okay, I'm gonna, in an effort to save time, because you're gonna hear more about this, I'm gonna go through this very quickly. There's a series of 4 steps. CEFF is a 12-step process. That's what it is. It's the way it gets all the way through. That's what all of us have been working on, is our 12-step process for the last 5 years. The first 4 steps are section A. This gets you the natural flow criteria, which Julie will be talking about. Section B, steps 5 through 7, is how to develop and or modify those flow criteria if you have channel alteration, if you have poor water quality, if you have additional considerations that might make those flows less functional than you require. And then step C is developing those ecological flow criteria. I'm gonna go through this fairly quickly, but essentially the idea behind section A is that building off of functional flows and taking into account that physical habitat, any biologic interactions, non-native species concerns, water quality, collectively together, those are gonna provide our ecological responses. So this is sort of the conceptual model we work around. And these are the 5 functional flows in California that we've determined that we then have metrics for. So we have that fall pulse flow, those peak magnitude flows, that spring recession flow. And then we distinguish a wet season base flow from a dry season base flow, because we have a wet season here in California. It is wetter, there should be more water in the river. And then we have a dry season. It is drier, there should be a little bit of a difference between that wet season and dry season. Our native species are adapted to it if you give them the other flow components that they need. Right? Flatlining it and providing the same flows all year is exactly what they have in the East Coast, and that's what our non-native species love. So trying to kind of move away from that just a little bit. So Ted's gonna talk about how we've modeled these natural functional flow metrics for every stream in the state, and he'll go through and explain that. Then all of this information has been put up on the Natural Flows web tool, which is the TNC Natural Flows database. So you can go click on any stream in the state and get a series of functional flow metrics that could serve as initial ecological flow criteria for your stream. And Julie's gonna go through and talk about that. Section B, you can modify if needed, if you wanna consider things like channel incision. Again, I recognize this slide is a little bit hard to read, so I'll try to move through this fairly quickly. But all of this information is on that CEFF.ucdavis.edu site. But you might need to consider, do I need to take into account water quality temperature? So for example, maybe my stream doesn't have any riparian vegetation left and my flows are really hot, and maybe there's some additional considerations I need to take into account. So there's a pathway and steps in section B to help you move through that and take that data, those more site-specific and species-specific information into account. And then lastly, in section C, there's guidance on how to go through and assess flow alteration, evaluate management scenarios, and assess trade-offs to come up with final environmental flow recommendations. It's an iterative loop. We definitely think of this as adaptive management, and that this would be an ongoing. You would come up with your environmental flows, you would come up with a plan to implement them, and then you would monitor them, and you would see if it works. And if it doesn't, you change it, and that's okay. We are never gonna get this 100% right, but we need to get out there and start doing stuff. So we do an adaptive management type of process to get going. There's also a way we have come up with to look at how altered the flows are. This information is also available on the Natural Flows database, and Julie and Kurt can go through and show this in more detail. So ultimately, the idea behind the framework is to help provide a consistent way for people to move through in an open and transparent way how they thought about coming up with their environmental flows. Half the game is getting people to actually be clear and open and talking to each other about what they're thinking. What science did you use? What species are you caring about? What are your trade-offs that you're interested in doing? And really trying to go through step by step to allow people to be able to communicate and talk to each other and share that information. So we're going to go through and talk through the tools today, and yeah, you'll hear more about that as we go. And then Chris already talked about the special issue, and that we've got some papers that you can look into. And there's a series of tools to help move through this framework that we've put together that you're going to hear about today. So Ted's going to talk about the modeling. Julie's going to talk about the Natural Flows database. And then at the end of the day, we've also put together an R package that allows you to go in and download and plot and do the alteration assessment to look at your particular location. And that's what Chris and those folks are going to go through at the end of the day today. Okay, and I think this is the last slide. This is still a living document. All of this is happening under the Water Quality Monitoring Council Environmental Flows Technical Subgroup. It's open to the public. We meet quarterly. And there's going to be links here that we'll provide in the slides that you are welcome to attend and join and stay up to date on how this is moving forward. Okay, and I think that's it. Thank you. It's very fast.
Yeah, that's fine.
All right, hi everyone. I'm Ted Grantham, Cooperative Extension Specialist at UC Berkeley, and I've been working with the technical team for the past several years, developing the California Environmental Flows Framework. You heard a great overview from Sarah, and now we're gonna do a little bit of a deeper dive into one technical aspect of CEFF, which is this work we did to model and predict the natural range of functional flows in all rivers and streams in the state. So this should look familiar to you now. In this section A, there are a series of steps that really starts with defining the goals for your system, the ecological management goals, and then estimating the natural ranges of flows for that system. So that's what we're going to focus on now. Again, we are trying to estimate what the natural range of conditions would be for these 5 functional flow components. And so we start by identifying the functional flow components that Sarah described, and then breaking those down into specific metrics. So again, a lot of terminology here, but we have our 5 components. Those in turn can be broken down into individual metrics that describe their magnitude, timing, duration, rate of change, and frequency. So one of the resources that you'll hear about a little bit later is the functional flow calculator. Basically what we've done is gone to every reference gauge in the state and taken the flow record for those sites and calculated the functional flow data. So you can actually go on, select a site, and pull up the hydrograph, and the functional flow metrics can be viewed. So here's in green here shows the natural range of variation at this site in peak flows, and that's then the timing of peak flows. This is sort of the percentile bounds for this one particular flow component. So we can do this from all the sites where we have data. These sites here are all the reference sites where we actually have more or less unimpaired hydrology. But we actually want to do this for the entire state. So how do we do this? So we start by going back to this pool of reference gauges, where we have an observed flow record. Many of these reference gauges are no longer reference. These are actually historical data that may have existed maybe before a dam was developed or before there was major changes in the watershed. But during the reference period for these gauges, at least, we can go to these watersheds, and we characterize the watersheds with a series of climate and physical variables. So what this is showing here is that we first take, again, our observed flow record, we apply this functional flow calculator, calculate our flow metrics, and that can give us like basically a time series of flow metric values. We go to our various GIS data sources. You heard about StreamCat earlier today. A lot of the similar data are used for this effort. So we characterize the climate, the geology, the soils, aspect, slope, et cetera. Basically anything you can think of to describe the natural watershed characteristics. And we do this for all reference gauges in the state. So for this full population, working with on the order of 220, 250 reference gauges. And then we basically put all this information together in machine learning models. We're using a random forest model where we try to relate the observed flow metrics to the watershed characteristics and see if there's a relationship between the flows we observe and the characteristics of the watersheds that we observe. And so we do this we develop separate models for every single functional flow metric that we're considering. And so here, just to remind you all, we see our 5 functional flow components on the left, the flow characteristics broken down there, and then the specific metrics on the right. So for example, for fault pulse flows, we're interested in sort of when they occur, the timing, the magnitude, and duration of those. And so we quantify those. And then for each of those metrics, we develop these models and ask, can we predict the values that we observe given the watershed characteristics that we've characterized? And just to show you kind of what the outputs look like, essentially, rather than trying to make predictions for individual years, we summarize, we sort of condense, I guess, the predicted values for all years, and we characterize the sort of range of observations. And so this sort of box plot describes the expected natural range of flows over a long-term period. And then we can break this down by water year types. So we can say, okay, given this, at a site, we might say this predicted value could say be peak magnitude flood, right? And over all years, we see this big range of values, but as Sarah alluded to earlier, in dry years, we have lower values, moderate and wet. They have slightly different ranges. So where we have these observed values of data from our reference gauges, we need to evaluate whether or not our model is performing adequately. So what we do is we screen out sites that have a relatively short period of record, and we basically compare our predicted ranges with our observed ranges at sites that are excluded from model training, right? So we don't want to train the model with data and then ask if it predicts well at those locations. So we reserve a subset of the data and make a prediction at those sites, and then we have a series of basically model performance criteria that we use to see how well do the predictions align up with our observations, and depending how closely they align can tell us how accurate, how reliable our model is. And so we have go back here, we have a series of criteria here that we evaluate. We look at, here you can see in the blue bars, that's representing the observed range of variation, and the red bars represent the predicted range of variation for a particular metric. And so we can look at, for example, the proportion or the percent of the observations that fall within our predicted range. And so if all of our observations align perfectly well with our predictions, then that would suggest good model performance. There's also other metrics you can use, like comparing the median values of the predictions and the observations, and look at things like the correlation coefficient or Nash Sutcliffe efficiency. So these are different performance metrics that take advantage of these data. And so for each of our metrics, we kind of went through each of these and to really try to understand how well the model was performing or not. But for the purposes of this presentation, we just sort of compiled all of those individual metrics into a single model performance criterion. And so we scaled all of these various performance criteria between 0 and 1, and put it on this scale, and this was consistent with some previous sort of guidelines put forward from hydrology modelers. So these are the results, and I guess sort of there was a lot of information that went into these data, but I guess sort of to make a long story short, we actually have quite good performance in our ability to predict our natural functional flow metric values at most of our sites. Of course, there are outliers and limitations that I can discuss in a little bit, but overall, with these watershed characteristics and this population of reference gauges, we are now able to make predictions of all of these metrics at other ungauged sites or sites that are gauged but are altered. In terms of the specific sort of differences here, we did very well in predicting magnitude metrics, excellent or very good. So wet season base flow, for example, or spring magnitude. We did less well in identifying, say, the timing of the pulse flow, for example. So a lot of the data, the input data that go into this model are based on monthly time scales. So we're not dealing with daily data. And so when you have individual storms, for example, that are determining when the fall pulse occurs, we have a hard time picking that up in our model. So for every one of these, there's a little bit of a story behind it, but that's just to give you an example of how to interpret these data. So now that we've sort of kicked the tires on these models and tested them and have some confidence that they're working relatively well, we can go to our stream network. So this is all the streams in the states represented by the National Hydrography Database, NHD, and we can take the same watershed characteristics that we used in model training, calculate them for every one of these streams, and then make a prediction with our trained models at those sites for the functional flow metrics. And so we have done this for 16 of the 24 metrics, and for the 8 of the metrics that didn't perform quite as well, we actually ended up using sort of the direct empirical observations for the different stream classes that are represented in these sort of colored bands, and I can talk more about that if there are questions after this session. But you're going to hear about it in a minute. We've taken all these data that are now accessible in this public repository, this natural flows database, and you're going to sort of see a live demonstration of this, but essentially you can zoom in on any river and stream in the state. This is the Napa River. You can click on a stream segment and you can pull up the model results for that system. And so here is the dry season base flow component and our various metrics. Here's the different percentile ranges. So again, we're predicting a sort of the expected range of values between the 10th and 90th percentile. And in some cases where we do have existing gauges, we can compare those predictions with observations and determine whether or not our observations are outside of the range of natural predicted values. Again, this is the sort of if you really want to get into more details, you can go to our manuscript here that you can access on our CEFF website. But just to kind of wrap this up, this approach has been pretty successful in predicting most of the functional flow metrics that we're interested in under the California Environmental Flows Framework. And these predictions are, I think, really at the core of that section A where we develop ecological flow criteria. And so we're basically, sorry about that, we're basically relying on these predictions to give us our first estimate of what we expect the ecosystem to need to support the functions that we're interested in. And so I think you'll hear a little bit about in the case study examples about ways in which we are working to improve upon some of the models and to guide basically future work in this area. So yeah, this work, just want to acknowledge all the folks that were involved in supporting this work, and particularly Darren Carlisle with USGS, who played a big role in putting all the pieces together for this effort. So thank you.
Thanks, Ted. So we're right on track pretty much. So we have about 10 minutes for a Q&A. So are there any questions for Sarah or Ted?
Clear as mud?
There's mine. Yeah. Oh, wait. I'm going to give you that. Sure.
So for your reference sites and getting the flows, first, thank you for the talk. That was a great summary of everything. Did you see any basis of how many reference sites you needed within a watershed to be able to predict the functional flows? For example, if you have one site that you have as a reference in a watershed, how well does that predict? And is there any challenge where, say, there's some environmental condition, or how well are the different conditions represented in the different areas such that some of that parameterization and how well it actually behaves is just that there may not be enough data on those types of locations, those characteristics of that watershed?
It's a great question. And I think there's sort of two dimensions to that I like to address. So the first is that when we sort of train these models, we use all of the data that is available from all of the reference gauges across the state. And so when we then go to, let's say, an ungauged location, we're using the models to predict flows at that location that takes advantage of all of the data that's available. So in other words, even if you just have one reference gauge in a region, we're still sort of relying on all of the gauges across the entire state to inform that prediction. That said, the second part of your question, there are certainly places where we have watershed characteristics that, let's say, are not as representative of our population of reference gauges. And so in those places, we would expect to have the model to have sort of more difficulty. And one example of that, large rivers, right? We have very few reference rivers the size of the Sacramento, for example, because it's been so altered. And there are other modeling efforts that have gone underway that we can actually include in this, that we've used in this model to kind of get at that. But we've realized that there are some places where, let's say, groundwater influenced streams. The model has had a little bit of a hard time of capturing groundwater dynamics, which reflects both the lack of reference gauges of that unique stream type, but also speaks to maybe some of the missing kind of physical variables that we just don't have available that might explain, the groundwater contribution. So I would say, we're fortunate in some ways in California to have, such a rich reference data set, but we certainly could use more. And I think the work that we've done, I think we would have a lot of recommendations for where the state might want to invest resources in developing new reference gauges to sort of help improve the models in sort of a strategic way. And hopefully that's something that will happen in the coming years. Does that make sense?
Yes. Awesome. Thank you.
Any other questions? One more.
Great talk. So my question is actually a direct follow-up from the last one. Did you guys participate in the SB 19 gauging prioritization plan to do just that in terms of identify locations where new gauges are needed or reactivation should be considered?
Yeah, we're in conversation. There was an initial phase of that sort of SB 19 sort of planning that was mostly involved in sort of assembling data and characterizing the existing gauge network. I think phase 2 is going to be actually identifying priority areas, and that work I don't believe has started yet, but we're hoping to be active parties in those conversations. Thank you.
So we're just on time. Thanks for those two presentations and sticking with the schedule. So we have a quick 5-minute break, and so we'll come back at 2:45. So you can shut your brain off for a little bit, and then we'll resume back. Thanks. Okay, hello. I think we're gonna get started in an interest of time. So we're going to be transitioning over to a couple of CEFF applications and how various programs and agencies are using CEFF. And so I'm going to hand the presentation over to Alyssa and Alex.
Thanks, Chris. Hi, everyone. My name is Alyssa Obister. I am a senior environmental scientist in the Department of Fish and Wildlife's in-stream flow program. Today, I am joined by my colleague, Alex Millward, and like Chris said, we're going to be talking about the ways that we at CDFW have utilized CEFF and the key CEFF tools. So a little bit of background on the flow program. We are based in headquarters in Sacramento, and our work has a statewide focus, which means that we get to work in watersheds up and down the state. Broadly, what we do is we develop in-stream flows to maintain, the in-stream flows required to maintain healthy aquatic ecosystems and those conditions. And we provide flow information in response to legislative mandates, so like those under the California Water Action Plan and those priority streams, or mandates as part of the Public Resources Code. We provide this technical flow-related support to our regional CDFW staff, so those staff that are working up and down the state with boots on the ground. We provide them that flow information. And we do this in the form of site-specific studies, so the more traditional resource, time-intensive, technical in-stream flow studies that you might be familiar with. And we also utilize desktop-based methods, where desktop methods rely on existing models and data sets to develop flow criteria. And we also produce flow information to support regulatory processes, and currently we're working on providing flow information to support some drought efforts. So we are a non-regulatory group, and kind of like I was saying in the previous slide, we provide that science-based information to identify flow criteria. And so in our program, our work is really focused on sections A and B of CEFF. Sarah had this up earlier, but just wanted to highlight here how the work that we do kind of lines up and parallels the CEFF process. So if you look to the right side of the screen, this is the Water Board's flow objective setting process, and the red box kind of indicates where we fit in. So like I said, we work on flow studies, and then we develop either flow criteria or flow recommendations, and then we provide this science-based work to the Water Board to inform their flow objective setting process and other water management decisions. So we have been involved in the development of CEFF as part of the technical team. So we've assisted in the development of the framework, we've tested out the tools, and we also attend the eFlows workgroup meetings. And Alex and I also serve as CDFW's internal CEFF resource. So we have trained over 100 CDFW staff in CEFF and the tools associated with CEFF. And we're excited to keep training staff on CEFF and serve as an internal resource to those within the department that are looking to learn about CEFF and its tools. All right, so now I'm going to hand it off to Alex, who's going to be talking about how we're actually using CEFF.
Thanks, Alyssa. Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Alex Millward. I'm an environmental scientist with the In-Stream Flow program at CDFW, and I'm just going to walk through how we in the In-Stream Flow program are applying CEFF tools to our work. So one of the major products of the In-Stream Flow program to which we apply CEFF tools like natural flows and functional flows are these watershed criteria reports. And watershed criteria reports offer us a rapid approach for developing watershed-wide in-stream flow criteria. And they serve as sort of an alternative investigation to those more site-specific, resource-intensive studies that Alyssa alluded to. And the reason we can do these so rapidly is because they can be developed using only publicly available existing data and tools like functional flows. That being said, we can and often will supplement these reports with site-specific transect data when available and when appropriate. So our watershed criteria reports consist of several components or sections. Some of these sections are just direct applications of these CEFF tools. We will look at natural unimpaired flows in the watersheds using the natural flows database. We have a section on functional flows, and then we include some additional desktop analyses geared towards other in-stream flow considerations or specific species life stage in-stream flow considerations. But the piece I want to focus on here today is functional flows. And we represent functional flows and their metrics for a handful of representative reaches throughout our watersheds. And we display those metric values in tables much like the one you see here on the left side of the screen, where we have functional flow metric values for 3 water year types for wet, moderate, and dry conditions. And we show for each metric the median functional flow metric value, followed by the range of functional flow metric values in parentheses. That's the 10th to the 90th percentile range of those calculated functional flow metrics. So with all that information, we can take a synthesis of those results in each of those sections to develop watershed-wide in-stream flow criteria. The foundation for these criteria really are functional flows, and we'll use those other in-stream flow considerations as sort of bookends or comparative metrics for some context around our flow criteria. So as you can see in that bottom table on the right, or not see very well, we share our flow criteria is made up of the wet season base flow, followed by the spring recession flow and each week thereof, receding by the rate of change as calculated in our functional flow metrics, and then we end with our dry season base flow. We then supplement to this sort of base flow centric criteria the 2 and 5 year peak flow events, as well as the fall pulse event at the start of every water year. When gauge data is available, we can actually calculate our functional flow metrics from that gauge data and take that flow criteria that results and develop these flow regimes to see how our flow criteria fit into the annual hydrograph in wet, moderate, and dry years. So beyond our desktop-based flow criteria and our watershed criteria reports, we can also apply functional flows to our field-based flow criteria. Field-based flow criteria here being those in-stream flow targets throughout the year that are the result of those highly intensive 1 and 2D hydraulic modeling efforts. So what we see here on this slide are 3 sets of flow criteria by water year type. Those are those black lines you see on those hydrographs. And we can assess whether this field-based flow criteria is naturally or is appropriately mimicking the natural hydrology in the watershed. And we do this by overlaying the 10th to the 90th percentile range of our functional flow metrics and to see how well our field-based flow criteria are capturing all 5 functional flow components. What we can see here is we can see the dry season base flow pretty well represented. We can see that elevated period of wet season base flow, and we can see that transition between the two, which is pretty indicative of our spring recession. We can then incorporate additional intra-annual variability by including the pulse flow event at the start of every water year, as well as the peak flow events, again, to make sure that our final flow criteria are as well ecologically functioning as possible and appropriately incorporate that natural hydrologic variability within the water year and across water years. So beyond our watershed criteria reports and our field-based criteria, we've provided functional flows information to our regional staff to help with things like drafting conditions for FERC licenses. We've provided flow information to help some legal processes that our regional staff are involved in. And more recently, we've been providing functional flows information to assist with our regional drought efforts and to facilitate conversations around water management in these exceptionally dry times. Moving forward, we're just really excited to continue using CEFF tools in our current and our future work. We're looking forward to implementing some of these tools in different permitting processes and assessing water rights applications. And we're currently in conversations with our groundwater program to figure out how we can sort of use CEFF tools to bridge the gap between surface water and groundwater management. Beyond that, like I said, we're going to just continue to use these tools to train CDFW staff and to continue being active participants in the CEFF technical team. Thank you so much for listening. You can reach out to Alyssa or myself if you have any more questions after today, and we'll also be around to answer questions in just a little bit. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Alex and Alyssa. So before we pause for Q&A, I'm going to give you a little bit of a high-level overview of how we've been using CEFF in Southern California, more specifically in South Orange County. And the goal for this study is to develop ecological flow criteria. So understand how much of the flows, what should the flow regime be to be supportive of our ecological management goals in this region. And so Alyssa and Alex really illustrated the use of natural functional flows, and I'm going to be giving you a different perspective in a region that's highly altered. We have a lot of stream channel erosion, so how do we incorporate more site-specific information to ensure that our flow criteria is supportive of the functions that we're intending to manage and support. And I do want to note that this study was funded by the Wildlife Conservation Board, the Stream Flow Enhancement Program, and also by Orange County Public Works. And I have all my colleagues here listed on this page. So taking a step back, we went over the framework in general, and we gave you a really quick crash course on kind of the science and the organization and structure. And we're now at a point that it's really critical for us to start implementing case studies across a diversity of streams and to answer a suite of various management questions. And so we need to implement these case studies to really demonstrate the application of CEFF across the state. We see CEFF as a living document, so as we implement more case studies, we're going to hit some roadblocks and hopefully create some lessons learned so we can refine our process and improve the framework and the guidance that we've provided. And then we also want to create templates for broader application, especially given the amount of time it takes to do these really high-intensity, site-specific studies. We want to create these templates that can help speed the implementation of environmental flows across the state. And then lastly, we want to build consistency through participation, especially participation of stakeholders and various agencies outside of our core technical team. And so we've already implemented a suite of case studies across the state to answer a wide range of management questions. These are just a couple of systems that we've already started or we have finished implementing CEFF. And so I do want to note that we have questions regarding dry weather diversions. We have questions regarding changes to wastewater discharges and wastewater reuse, like in the LA River. We also have questions about how much of the stream flow should be diverted for agriculture and irrigation, and questions about further understanding groundwater surface water interactions. And I do want to note that people on our technical team have conducted some supplemental bioassessment studies that are linking functional flow alteration to our biological stream condition indices, the CSCI and ASCI. We've had a study conducted across the state by Ryan Peak, and also a regional study focused in on Southern California. And those are both readily available in the Frontiers Environmental Science special issue. So today I'm going to be focusing in on a case study that we've done in South Orange County. And so this CEFF case study application was conducted in a highly modified urban watershed where establishing reference-based flows may be a challenge. So we've seen rapid urbanization in this region. We see extensive channel erosion, incision, and widening, and then flows may be far from reference in this area. And on top of that, we have augmented flows, primarily in the dry season, that may actually be supporting novel ecosystems that may not have been there under a more natural, drier condition. And so that makes things a little bit challenging. I do want to note that this is a unique watershed where we have flow modifications that are coming from diffuse non-point sources. So we have irrigation overflow, we have urban runoff, and we don't have that typical single point of a knob to turn like in a dam regulated system or in a system that has a single point of diversion. So that, again, making it a little bit more challenging in this setting. And then lastly, I want to note that groundwater may be a significant contributor to the summer base flows. So it was really important for us to try to quantify how much of the summer base flows are coming from groundwater versus imported water. And that's because through the MS4 permits in this region, there's a provision to recycle and capture and divert the dry weather, clean it, and then reuse it. So we really want to understand how much of that should be recycled and reused. And so in terms of this CEFF case study, our main objective is to provide a demonstration of CEFF in a highly altered region, both altered in hydrology and altered in geomorphology. We also want to develop ecological flow criteria that considers this altered landscape and the altered channel morphology, and are also supportive of key ecological management goals that are related to specific species of management concern. And then lastly, we provide an example of how changes to the channel morphology through stream restoration could be made to try to make more out of the water that we currently have. And so this is a consideration in CEFF Section C, where we're thinking about alternative management scenarios on top of flow management. And so we worked really closely with the stakeholder working group in this region. We met with them around quarterly to identify what are our ecological management objectives, and then we also met with them to talk about our technical work and the data tools that we ultimately developed through this study. So this is a list of our key management objectives, starting more broadly and then getting into a more narrow focus. So we want to improve stream flow conditions to benefit overall stream ecosystem health. We want to reduce unnatural flows that favor invasive species. So what are the flows that we should be supporting to support the aquatic life beneficial uses in the region? And then more specifically, we want to provide habitat to support federally endangered birds, the leaf spells vireo. For this study, we're using black willow as a surrogate for riparian habitat for these sensitive bird species. And then lastly, we want to restore habitat for native fish populations. And so for this study, we're focusing in on Aroa chub, which is native to the region. But I do want to note that Aroa chub is not currently observed in the study reach that we conducted in, but there is a desire to improve stream flow conditions to be more conducive for these aquatic species. So as I mentioned earlier, we're working in Southern California, the South Orange County Watershed Management Area. This includes multiple coastal draining watersheds, including Aliso Creek, which is the purple tone watershed, and San Juan Creek in the red color. The focus of this presentation is going to be on lower Aliso Creek. So there's, let me see if I could use this pointer. No. So it's at the outlet of that purple, very skinny watershed. And so in this region, altered hydrology and channel erosion have been identified as the highest priority water quality conditions in this region. And so I'm not going to go into all of the steps that we took through CEFF. We did follow all the steps, and that's outlined in the paper, and I'll provide a link for that. But I do want to highlight some key components of the various sections of CEFF. So through Section A, it's all about identifying the natural ranges of functional flows. We heard a lot about the modeling for that. A key component of Section A is to ask, are there non-flow limiting factors like channel erosion, water quality, biotic interactions that may actually limit the natural range of flows from supporting the key functions that we're aiming to support? And so once we identify if there's some limiting factors, we jump into Section B, and we can incorporate the more site-specific information and develop our ecological flow criteria for those focal flow components. So through Section B, we use two different approaches. We use habitat suitability curves and also a habitat rule set. So I'm going to give you an example of each of those. And then in Section C, we evaluated an alternative management scenario through channel rehabilitation. And so as I mentioned earlier, a real uncertain question that we had is how much of the summer base flows are from groundwater versus imported water. And so we utilized an isotope study conducted by Dr. Lai at San Diego State to try to quantify groundwater contributions to the summer base flows across various stream reaches of the study region. And so we used this information to develop a detailed watershed model. And so we worked with Geosyntec, who used LSPC, to try to account for the spatial variability in groundwater inputs across the entire study region. And with this model, we're able to simulate the natural ranges of those functional flow metrics, incorporating kind of the groundwater contributions. And then we also have the utility to understand what are the current flows, so where are the flows altered, during what time, and in what direction. And then we also looked at future projected scenarios of climate change and increased water conservation. And so, as I mentioned, a key component of Section A is to ask the question, are there any non-flow limiting factors that we need to consider more in Section B? And so for this study, we found that altered channel morphology was the potential limiting factor that could affect our functionality of the natural ranges of flows. And so we identified for the wet season base flow, dry season base flow, and the spring recession flow that altered channel morphology may need to help. We need to consider altered channel morphology when we develop our flow recommendations. So let's take spring flow recession as an example. So if we have a widened channel or an incised channel, we likely need higher flows to actually inundate the floodplain if we want to get support functions associated with seed dispersal or associated with floodplain inundation. And so we really need to consider more site-specific information on the channel morphology to support those functions. So in Section B, this conceptual model may be familiar. A key step in Section B is to lay out how are we going to consider what functional flow components are we going to focus in on. So we developed a conceptual model for Arroyo Chub. We focused on the wet and the dry season base flow, and we want to relate that to the physical habitat, the depth and velocity in that widened channel morphology. And so we used a hydraulic model to model stream hydraulics across a range of flows to understand the physical habitat suitability for Arroyo Chub. We also used habitat suitability curves to help identify if there's an optimal range of flows that would be supportive of our ecological response, which is survival of Arroyo Chub. And so this is just one example of the habitat suitability curves. The top one on the x-axis is depth. So as you increase depth, you increase the probability of occurrence, which is the y-axis, and the bottom one is for velocity. And so you can see for velocity, there's kind of a sweet spot, an optimal range where we get the peak. So there may be a range of flows that may be most supportive of our Arroyo Chub. Now for black willow, we used a different approach. And so we have our functional flow components that we are considering for in Section B. So we have our wet and our dry season base flow and the spring recession flow. We modeled the stream hydraulics across a range of flows in this widened channel morphology to understand how flow and depth or inundation in the floodplain relates to the discharge in the stream. And then we applied a habitat suitability rule set to try to identify what our lower and our upper limit of our ecological flow criteria should be with consideration to this widened channel morphology. And then we use this to identify our optimal flow ranges. So this is just an example of the habitat suitability rule set where we have the various life stages, adult and seedling, related to the functional flow metric. So we have the wet and the dry season base flow and the spring recession flow. And then we created rules for the lower and the upper limit. So I know it's hard to see, so we'll take the spring recession flow as an example. For the lower limit, we want to ensure that the flow will get flows necessary to inundate the overbanks by at least 10 centimeters. And so we incorporate that to identify those lower limits. So we want to make sure that maybe the natural range of flows may not be high enough to actually get in the overbanks. So that's just one illustrative example of what we used. And so through CEFF, we identified our ecological flow criteria for all the functional flow components and the functional flow metrics based on the natural range of flows, which is the third column here through section A. And then we slightly adjusted our ecological flow criteria to account for the needs of black willow to ensure that we're supporting functions needed to support the riparian habitat. And so those are the values that we slightly adjusted. And these values incorporate the altered channel morphology. I do want to note for a road chub, we found that we would need really high base flow values that are only observed during large storm events to actually get the depths necessary to support a road chub because the channel is so widened. And so additional changes to the channel morphology may be needed if we want to provide suitable depths for a road chub during the base flow times. And so that leads us to, in section C, we wanted to answer the question of, can we get more out of the water that we currently have? And so we know that the existing channel morphology is too wide to provide suitable depths. You can see in this illustration that our flow is just spread out between the broad channel bottom. And so we explored an example channel design with a narrower channel and an inset floodplain. So this is just an illustration here. And so with the same amount of flow, we would get more suitable, deeper depths that would support a road chub. Of course, this was not meant to be a very detailed stream restoration planning project, but this kind of sets the stage of the types of alternative management scenarios that we can look at and the trade-offs between physical habitat and flow and the importance in interaction between both of them. And so overall, CEFF provides flexible guidance. There's multiple different approaches that can be implemented in section B. Sarah kind of gave an example of all the different environmental flow methods. There's different habitat suitability curves and different models that could be used. But it really depends on the management questions that are being asked and the available data that you have in your specific region. And so we found that two very different approaches can be used, like a rule set versus more quantitative flow ecology curves could be used. In highly altered systems, the consideration of mediating factors are really important when developing ecological flow criteria, especially in an area that has a lot of channel enlargement, in areas where there's a lot of water quality impairments or stream temperature issues, or in areas where there's maybe biotic interactions that need to be considered further. And non-flow management actions may be necessary to achieve the ecological flow criteria, as I illustrated through the example with channel restoration. CEFF can also be used to prioritize areas and inform channel restoration designs, and that's kind of where we're heading in the next phase of this study. So the South Orange County flood study is completed. We've identified where and when flows are altered across all the different functional flow metrics, and the next step is working with the co-permittees in the region to get on-the-ground projects where we can actually address the augmented flows, and we can start to plan out where would be best to restore the channel. So with that, here's the link to the study, and again, I'll provide you with all the links that we have during all of these, after this workshop. If you have any questions, feel free to email me. I should have put this earlier, so this is a picture of Lower Aliso Creek. This just illustrates the bank erosion that's happening in this region. This was taken in 2012, where we had a massive channel widening to the point that it undermined a pipe. And so you can see that it's also eroding into in a road. So I just wanted to give you a little bit of a snapshot into what the channel looks like. So with that, I think I'm going to open the floor to questions for me or Alyssa and Alex.
Hello. I'm sorry. I just have a quick question. So does CEFF really apply for natural stream bodies, or like what is it? How does it play into areas that are concrete channels and restoration?
Yes, that's a really good question. And so CEFF can apply in pretty much any type of stream that you're working in. One of the studies that we just completed was in the LA River. And so it's pretty much completely a flood control channel. There's a couple of soft bottom reaches, but we may not use the flow recommendations from Section A, so the natural range of flows, because we know the flows are so altered, and the channel morphology is completely different than what it would have been under natural conditions. And so in that example, we would need to go into Section B to consider that altered channel morphology and try to get a better handle on what the flows would need to be.
The ecological flows you were showing for the spring recession flow, 33 to 200 CFS, that's just for the ecological functions that you're looking at, right? But not what's provided by the stream right now.
Yeah, that's a really good question. Yes, those are just kind of serving as our flow target or our ecological flow criteria. The current flows, I think, are actually higher than that because of the upstream urbanization. We get a lot more flashier flows that are coming to the channel quicker. And we tend to have like a really steep rate of change because of the urban impervious surfaces.
So those won't be considered peak flows? Those are still considered part of the spring recession flows? Those flashy?
Yeah. So that brings us to a really good point. So in systems like what we see in Southern California and urban systems, we usually don't have a typical like a snowmelt recession that we see in like some of the Northern California streams. So yeah, we tend to have flashier flows, but they are equally important in terms of cues to the ecology. So we still consider them because they're in the right season and they're providing some of the same functions, even though they may be a little bit more flashy.
All right, thank you.
Okay, if we don't have any more, we'll transition over to the tools.
Hi, everybody. I'm Julie Zimmerman. I'm Director of Science for the California Water Program for the Nature Conservancy. And we are going to be talking about tools. I'll be just introducing them, and then I'm going to turn it over to my colleague, Kurt Klossmeyer, to do a more of a hands-on kind of demo. And then Chris is going to talk a little bit about some future directions. And then after that, we will actually work with people one-on-one with the tools, whoever's interested. So that's what we're doing for the rest of the day. So the tools that we produced for CEFF, a lot of them are related to these predictions of functional flows metrics. And most of all of those flow predictions live on the Natural Flows web app, which is at rivers.codefornature.org. This is a site that was built and is maintained by the Nature Conservancy. It looks like this. You can go to the web app, you see a map of California, and it has all the stream reaches in blue and stream gauges in this kind of red color, and you can click on any stream reach and get flow predictions. We have more than one data set, though, available on the tool. So some of the work we did predated CEFF. the Nature Conservancy partnered with TED, Grantham with UC Berkeley and USGS to predict monthly natural flows. That was kind of before we started the CEFF work. So there's a data set on here that will give you monthly natural flows from 1950 up to current. We're updating it with each month as we get climate data out of PRISM. So that's one data set. Then there's another data set, which are the functional flow metrics, and that's over a static period of record, 1950 to 2015. And we just received funding from WCB to add some more model data that we will be uploading to the site when that's done. It's a 3-year grant, but that is working with another group, Upstream Tech, to predict daily flows, both unimpaired and actual, also for all these stream reaches in the state. So that's ongoing work. There's also the functional flows calculator, which is where you can upload a daily time series of flow, and it'll calculate functional flow metric predictions for you. That now currently is on a different website, but we are going to migrate that over to the Natural Flows web app, so it will also be here. And there's also something called the Natural Flows Drought Monitor. So Kirk will show you this, but on the front page, there's kind of all these different links, and one of them is the Natural Flows Drought Monitor, which lets you know for any given month and year what your flows look like relative to all the flows over the period of record from 1950 for that same month and year. So it'll just tell you under natural conditions, this is kind of, are you in drought status or not? So that's another tool we have. So anyway, there's kind of a lot going on, and we're still actively working on this. So I just wanted to set the stage before I turn it over to Kirk.
Thanks, Julie. I'm Kirk Klausmeyer with the Nature Conservancy, and I'm excited to talk to you guys today about how you can actually take some of this data and implement it in the rivers that you're interested in. And so to start, just wanted to show an image. I used machine learning to generate this image and artificial intelligence. This is from the DALL-E website, and all you do is you type in some text, and the computers go and they generate a unique image for each text you introduce. So I put in a river of data to talk about these natural flows, and this is what it generated. I think it took a few times, but I think it looks pretty cool. And this is, I thought it was appropriate since, as Ted mentioned, all of this data that we're talking about today was generated with some of these advanced machine learning techniques. So it's really complicated modeling, building on some technology that has been developed for a lot of other purposes. But it's really exciting to be able to leverage that data and those methods for conservation, for river management in California. Oh, that's the right one. So now I'm going to sit down, and I apologize. I hate presenting while sitting, but it's just easier to run the computer, and I'll do a live demo. So am I still on the mic here? Okay. So the main URL, as has been mentioned several times, rivers.codefornature.org. This is the landing page, but you can also go to the CEFF website and get a link to it. And I'm just going to switch over to the live database. I'm a mapping guy, so I like to go to the map page first. And as you can see, this is just like any Google map. I can zoom in and out. And I'm going to ask for a little audience participation. Is someone tell me a river they're interested in? I'm hearing the Yuba. And since that person went first, they win. So this tool has a nice search function. You can, as it says here, you can enter in a river name. You can enter in latitude and longitude coordinates. You can also use a specific number called the COM ID that comes from the NHD plus data set developed by the federal government. So if you know specifically the COM ID you want, you can just type that in. Since we're talking about the Yuba, I'm just going to type that in and see what happens. So that gives me some stream segments, some gauges, and then also some place names. So if I wanted to go to Yuba County or Yuba River Court in Stockton, that's not the right Yuba we want. Let's go to a gauge. And let's go to not the Feather River at Yuba, but let's go ahead and go to this gauge at the Middle River, Yuba River. So then that just pulls up this window that is pointing to that location. And just to be clear, I can click on this river to make sure that I'm at the right location. So this is the Middle Yuba River. And just a quick reference for the legend here, the legend, the blue dots represent stream gauges that were part of the reference data set that Ted talked about. So these are the less altered streams. They may have been less altered historically. They currently are altered, but there's some period of record where there was less alteration. And then the other gauges are all the other gauges where we have stream flow data. And then we took those gauges and related them to the closest stream segment, and then just characterized what kind of data we have for each stream segment. So blue rivers mean we have just modeled data. There's no observation data in this data set. It's just the modeled functional flow data as well as the monthly data. And then the pinks and purples indicate we have some observed data to kind of compare. So then we could start making these inferences about is it altered or not. So there's several gauges along here that you can also see there's some large reservoirs. Let's go ahead and click this stream segment, Middle Yuba River. And let me try this one. And this one. Okay, here we go. So this first window that pops up will give you all the functional flows, and this is broken out by the different types of flow metrics. So here, the different components. So this is the dry season base flow component. I can also look at peak flows. I can look at spring recession flow. So they're all there. You just have to click a little bit to find them. Let's focus on dry season base flow. And if you aren't quite sure what the words mean, you can always hover over the words to get a little bit of a tooltip to tell you what that means. And then for this stream segment, the natural expected dry season base flow would be 12 CFS. So that's kind of our best guess of what we think the natural would be. What we've observed for over 25 years is the observed base flow for dry season is only 3.9 CFS. And this one's coming up as red. So that means this flow is low enough that it's considered altered based on the sort of the rules that the CEFF team has established. And you can see 3.9 is below this 10th percentile flow. So Ted showed you those box plots. This would come up significantly below the range of values that we would model for this river. So something's going on. I don't know the system. There's probably a lot of hydropower and flood and irrigation modifications. So there's something going on that's altering this dry season base flow compared to what it would be naturally based on this data. We can do the same for peak flows. We can see the 2-year flow magnitude is relatively low, 200 CFS, where the expected natural would be 900 CFS. We can change this to 10-year peak flows. They're also low. compared to natural. So this is a pretty modified system for the middle Yuba. It's typical when you see something right below a dam to have a lot of modifications to functional flows. And then just one more thing I'll show, wet season base flow. We can look at all years, we can look at dry years, we can look at moderate years and wet years. So you can get all the data that we talked about already are available in this user interface. Julie mentioned the monthly flows, so I'm just going to show those briefly. This is just kind of a hydrograph of the monthly flows. So here we've got each month on the x-axis and then the magnitude on the y-axis. And you can see the purple line is the observed data, significantly lower for basically all months. And then these three lines equal the dry year, moderate year, and wet year expected monthly flows. We also have a little tool that says which months have the worst alteration based on the observed data. And if there's red bars below the zero line, that's bad. So this is, again, showing significant alteration. August and September, a little less altered, interestingly enough, in this system. And then finally, we've got a visualization of all the monthly flows back from starting in 1950 to the current month, almost current. This is August 2022 is the most recent prediction. Dark blues indicate higher flows, light blue, less flows. And you can sort of look at any one month and year to figure out what that expected flow was, or modeled flow. The other thing that sometimes people miss is this little plus button here, add stream to queue. So now I can put it over in this little box over here. That means I can now download the data. Sometimes our graphs or our summaries aren't what you want. You can go ahead and download the data. You can click on what type of statistics for the monthly. For the functional flow data, these little things aren't relevant. You always get all the functional flow data because it's a little bit of a smaller data set. So if you want the functional flow metrics, you just click that button. It comes down as a CSV. If you want to get even more detailed, you can go to this data page. If you want to do things like download data for a unique subset of COM IDs, or for only January every other year, or if you want to get a little bit more detailed on how you're accessing the data, you can access our API directly. We've got some tools, some sample code, better explanation of each of the field values, what they represent. And then, yeah, again, some sample code in both Python and R. And then the last thing I wanted to show here is this is a living database. As Julie mentioned, we're actively updating it. We're adding new things as we go. And so every time we make a change, we're trying to track that change and just explain what we did and why. And always reach out to myself, to Julie, to people on the CEFF team if you have questions about this. The final thing I'll show is this apps page as part of the live demo. So Julie mentioned this drought flows monitor. You can click on this. This is just another slice of the data where we take the most recent monthly flow and compare it to the range of historic values, just to get a sense of how bad is the drought. And in here, the reddish colors mean it's worse. So this is just another way we can use these data for different applications. And then finally, we're going to do a little deep dive on the functional flows calculator. Sorry, I'm losing my voice. Maybe I'll turn it over to Chris to cue this up here.
Thanks, Kirk. Yeah, so if you stick around after the workshop, so we have one more presentation, we're going to be, I think we have enough room where we can just sit in the areas here. I'm going to go over the functional flows calculator. It's basically a tool that calculates the functional flow metrics from any continuous daily flow time series that could be modeled or can be from gauge data. And we use, it uses the functional flows calculator, which uses a signal processing algorithm. So I linked, I put the reference of the paper that goes into the nuts and bolts of the calculator and how it works. I'm not going to go into all of that today, but I am going to demo the R package, and I'll show you how to read in data, some of the different functionalities of the tools, how to set it up, and we'll go through a couple of different examples. And we also have a Python package, so that's the actual native code for the functional flows calculator was written in Python. And so we have webinars and online resources for that one. And then we have the eFlows website too that you can take a look at eflows.ucdavis.edu. So we'll continue this at 4.
And then just to close really quickly, there you can use machine learning to generate visuals for presentations, or you can just do the old-fashioned way, which is Google things and find animated GIFs. That's what I usually do. So if you don't use the functional flow tools, you might end up with sad fish like these ones. But if you do use these tools, this is much more what we're hoping to find. Thank you.
So we'll have time after this for Q&A on the online natural flows database. Thanks, Kirk and Julie. Okay, thanks everyone for sticking around. I know this is a lot of information thrown at you in a relatively short period, and so we're happy to continue the discussion at the happy hour mixer or after this or anytime within the meeting or via email. So I wanted to kind of wrap up the workshop and talk to you all about what's next with CEFF. And I want to highlight a couple of key areas that we think are key interest areas of focus in the future. And so we've developed a CEFF implementation work plan. We know that there's additional work needed to support the statewide implementation of CEFF. And so this work plan kind of lays out improvements in the technical tools. That includes modeling, and includes some of the online tools that we've developed. Tracking and documenting case studies. So you've seen in the list here that there's multiple case studies being implemented. We want to make sure that these case studies are documented in a standard way. We have data that can be used to inform and revise the framework, and there's mechanisms for ongoing data and information sharing into the future. And we see this work plan as a living document that should be reviewed and updated periodically. And so I have the link here. It's located on our CEFF website at ceff.ucdavis.edu/tech report. And this is the same location where you can download the guidance document and also our implementation work plan. And so today I just want to highlight a couple of key areas in terms of technical tool advancement. One of which is being modeling current or actual flows in ungauged systems for our alteration assessment, and also to fully evaluate trade-offs as we want to consider other uses of water in CEFF Section C, especially if we want to do this in an spatially explicit manner across all the stream reaches in the state of California. The next one that I'm going to go into a little more detail is understanding interactions between flow and temperature to inform the management of temperature-dependent species. So we spent a lot of time on functional flows. We need the habitat, we need the flows, but we also need the water quality conditions, including stream temperature, to support the ecosystem. And then lastly, predicting groundwater contributions to allow for more holistic management of water resources. And we know how difficult it is to measure and model those low flows, so getting a better handle on quantifying how much of the groundwater is contributing to some of those dry season flows are really critical to inform both surface water and groundwater management. And so let's start with the first one. We spent a lot of time talking about the statewide model that predicts natural functional flows. So we have that across the entire state of California. But one of the critical gaps is understanding what are the actual flows. Where are flows altered, in what direction, during what time? And so this is a key area. We know that a lot of the streams in California are ungauged. We know that we don't have a lot of detailed watershed models at all of the stream reaches across the state. And so it's a critical component for CEFF Section C when we evaluate alteration. It's also really important for ultimately the development of environmental flow recommendations, especially across the entire state of California. And so Julie mentioned that there's various efforts conducted right now on modeling actual flows or alteration or actual functional flows, flow metrics, and that'll just help us enable alteration assessments across the entire state. And this is done with Upstream Tech. In San Diego, in the San Diego region, we're working with Chad Laughlin and the San Diego Water Board on similar effort trying to predict alteration of functional flow metrics based on current and future conditions. And so that's another effort here. But it's always a challenge. It's a challenge to get that across an entire region or state. And then lastly, with this information, it can allow us to further understand how alteration of functional flows may affect biology to ultimately inform trade-offs. So when we're thinking about stream flow diversions and decreasing in-stream flows, how is the alteration going to impact the ecology? And so this includes alteration effects of umbrella species, species that are representative of full community assemblages. So Alyssa Obester's done, she published a study where she lays out a process and an approach to how do we actually select umbrella species, and she focused on native fish in California. This type of analysis can be done at, across a variety of different ecological endpoints of concern. And again, we want to understand how alteration of functional flows will impact these type of species. And then we're also interested in understanding the relationship of alteration of functional flows on our bioindices, the California Stream Condition Index and the Algal Stream Condition Index. And so we've conducted studies statewide and in Southern California, but these studies were primarily focused on bioassessment sites that are co-located to stream gauges or have a detailed watershed model where we can calculate functional flow metrics. And so we know that there's a wealth of bioassessment data and biological survey data that's been collected across our entire state. And so with this information, if we're able to model actual flows across the entire region, we can leverage that data that's been collected and get a better understanding of how changes in flow may impact the ecology. And we know that it's not just flow. There's all these other factors that need to be in place in order to provide those stream functions, in order to have a healthy ecosystem. And one of these areas that we want to spend more time is understanding the interaction between flow and stream temperature. And this is particularly important in informing management of temperature-dependent species like fish. And in certain regions, there may be temperature standards that are being developed. We want to ensure that these standards are biologically relevant. So we need better tools. We need more models to help us with that. That includes the relationship between functional flow metrics and stream temperature. This could include stream temperature models. And these types of models can also allow us to look at how changes in climate, precipitation, and temperature may impact functional flows and stream temperature as well. And then we want to kind of circle the loop and understand the interactions between changes in flow, temperature, and aquatic life. And so that's one of the key focus areas that we're hoping to develop more tools and strengthen our understanding of these relationships. We also know that many of the systems in California are strongly influenced by groundwater, and we've heard a lot of talks today about intermittency and how difficult it is to really model and even measure those low flows during the dry season. And so we want to be able to improve our predictions of groundwater contributions to really get a better handle on the summer base flows in our systems, especially in these systems that are strongly influenced by groundwater. So this could include statistical or mechanistic groundwater surface water models. That could include remote sensing techniques and other technologies and tools to help us really get a better handle on groundwater contributions. And ultimately, we want to provide this information to strengthen and create more holistic water resource management that considers both groundwater management, groundwater pumping, and how that may impact in-stream flows and vice versa. And so one of the key areas that we're working on right now is how do we better coordinate and work with various groundwater programs that are being implemented in the state. And so one of them is the Sustainable Groundwater Management Act, SGMA, FloodMAR, so flood management, managed aquifer recharge, and other programs that consider the interaction between surface water and groundwater. And so we feel like CEFF is a great tool that can help inform these various programs. But of course, it's really easy to talk about CEFF and kind of the theory, but it's so important to have case studies implemented on the ground to really lay a roadmap and illustrate how these tools can be used. And so we need additional CEFF case studies, especially in areas where SGMA is being implemented in high priority groundwater basins, for example. And so we're working with a couple of groundwater sustainability agencies across the state of California to try to help advise them on how they can use CEFF to inform sustainable groundwater management across the state. This is to be continued, and I know there's a lot that needs to be done, but this is one of the key areas that we're hoping to work on. And of course, we want input from you. We spend a lot of time speaking to you, but we want to hear from you. We developed a Google form here that allows you to kind of score the different elements of our work plan according to needs. So we want to know, what are your priorities, what are your needs? That will ultimately help us when we start prioritizing which types of elements of the work plan we should pursue funding. We also want to know if there's any missing key elements that are important to you that should be included in this work plan document. And then, of course, there's opportunities to pose your questions and comments as well. And then lastly, I want to say that we would be happy to collaborate with you all on some of the elements of the work plan, especially if we had shared priorities and or on case studies. So all of us on the tech team are happy to partner with you all. And we already talked about this, just a reminder of the functional flows R package demo after this. So with that, here are all of our contact information of all the presenters today. Wanted to thank you all for joining in, and I think we have a little bit of time. We have about like 10 minutes for Q&A for the online tool or any other questions that we maybe didn't have time for earlier on.
Yeah, hi. I had a question about the online map that Kirk showed. When you were talking about the stream segments and the coloration, you said that it was blue if it was just modeled, but if it was observed data, it was a different color. I was just wondering what the observed data type is and like what are the sources that you're pulling from?
Yeah, the observed data is only coming from USGS stream gauges. So we don't have any other data sources in this database right now. So if it's Department of Water Resources gauge that isn't listed also on USGS, it doesn't include that data. That's another future endeavor that we'd like to incorporate all the other state-run and even some of the local gauges if possible.
And what are the sources for the historical data? And what happens when there's, say, a tributary, like a small tributary stream where there's not historical data for it, but it's listed on the map? You know, you can search for that COM ID for that stream. Like, how is that prediction or estimate made?
I'll take a stab at this. The historical data is all coming from USGS as well. Some of the gauges go back into the 1800s, and so the USGS has gathered all of that data. When there isn't a stream gauge, we have monthly flow estimates from 1950 to the present, and that is based on this modeling, this machine learning modeling. So there's no stream gauge there, but we have climate data, we have precipitation, temperature. That's all coming from the PRISM data set, and then a variety of other sources of geology, slope aspect that's coming from other GIS sources. And so we know the temperature and precip back to 1950. We have these models developed from the reference sites, and then we put that together to generate these estimates, even when there is no historical data.
Sorry, on a tangent. So have you tested it on these sites where you don't have any observed data?
Yes. The modeling effort, I'm looking at Ted back there. You're hiding, so I might call you in. But the modeling effort involved testing and training. So you take a subset of the reference gauges and you train the model, and then you take another set that the model has never seen and test it and say, okay, how well did the model perform? And so you're able to make this thought experiment. If we didn't have a gauge, how well would we would predict what it would be? And then, let's look at the gauge data we have and see how well it does. So that's how you develop the accuracy assessment, and you can see how well does it do, and that's what Ted was showing with the different colors between excellent, good, very good. Okay, I'm getting thumbs up from Ted. Just one more thing towards the future. I'd like to take in other gauge data from other sources that we haven't even looked at yet, like DWR gauges, and then continue that accuracy assessment.
So this is, I would say, more of a question of a future detail that would be helpful, is that for a lot of your study, Chris, you were having these relationships between what the black willow needed or the arroyo chub needed, and there seemed to be hydraulics associated with it. And some of these relationships likely already exist in the literature, but how much work did you have to do to actually put those forth and select those species, and then the hydrology and the hydraulics, and like, is there going to be a plan for providing some reference, like if you're interested in these species, go here, we agree with these, we think these are well vetted, and provide good ecological flow criteria for these species of interest for management?
Yeah, thanks. That's a really good question. And I don't know if I mentioned, but Katie Irving was she's my colleague, and she worked on developing the curves for Aroa chub. And so we used existing data, so we didn't have funds to actually go out and collect the data. And so we used existing studies and data to develop those curves. And then as much as we can, we use previous studies and literature to try to help us identify if there's some thresholds in terms of velocity or depth that we would need to support those different species of concern. In terms of developing kind of one ecological flow criteria that would be supportive of, let's say, Aroa chub, I don't think that that's possible because of all the different the different variability in the channel morphology and the watershed setting. It may be, an upper tributary, the flow would probably need to be a lot lower than in a lowland downstream tributary. So I don't think there's kind of a magic number or a magic range of numbers. It really depends on the watershed context. The goal is that, we can leverage the existing studies that have been done by folks like CDFW and, in academia and things like that to try to help us validate or refine our flow criteria in areas that are altered. It's a little bit more straightforward if you're in more of a reference stream where you don't have channel alteration, you don't have water quality concerns. You can pretty much use section A. You don't need to go into section B. You can use the natural range of flows because we have no reason to believe that those flows won't be supportive of the functions. When you're in the more urban systems, like what we see in places like Southern California, that's when it's more important to go into section B because you have to consider the alterations. Yeah, that's a really good suggestion, and we don't have anything in place right now, but I think that's a really important thing that we can probably include in our implementation work plan as kind of a next step because there has been a lot of good studies, but it takes so much time to sift through the data and to clean it and to standardize it. So yeah, that's a good suggestion. I will note that in the North Coast, we're starting to do that effort for a project that we're working with the State Water Board for the cannabis policy development. And so we've done like a review of what studies have been done, and we're trying to kind of catalog that, but we don't have kind of all of that data readily available on an online portal at this point. But I think we're in the direction of doing that. Thanks. Okay, well, we're right at 4. I'm really happy. I was afraid that we wouldn't have enough time. So thank you everyone for attending. And for those of you who are interested in the R demo, you can move over here. There's plugs for your laptops, and I can get my laptop plugged in here. Thanks.